Hello, AP Environmental Science. This unit is about land, public and private, the land use concepts and how we classify them, and land management practices. Forested lands are dominated by trees and other woody vegetation. About 73% of the forested is used for, I'm sorry, Approximately 73% of forest is used for commercial timber operations, and that's in the United States, and almost all of that is privately owned. Many national forests were originally established to ensure the steady and reliable source of timber, and commercially logging companies are currently allowed to harvest U.S. national forests, usually in exchange to harvest the U.S. national forest for a royalty or a percentage of the revenue. So when they log these national forests, they're supposed to give the government some money for it. The federal government typically spends more money managing the timber program and the building and maintaining of these logging roads than it does receiving any money in revenue or royalties. So essentially, stabilizing the timber program is the same as the overgrazing of the rangelands. It's a negative monetary thing for the government. The two most common ways in which trees are harvested for timber production are clear cutting and selective cutting, both of which are illustrated in the next slide. All right, clear cutting involves the removal of all or almost all of the trees in an area, and it's the easiest harvesting method, and in most cases, it's obviously the most economical. So when a stand or a cluster of trees has been clear cut, foresters often replant or reseed this area. Often the entire area will be replanted at the same time, so all of the resulting trees will be the same age. Because they are exposed to full sunlight, clear cutting tracts of land are ideal for fast growing trees that can grow to a maximum height in the middle of direct sunlight. Because other species may not be so successful in these conditions, there is an overall reduction in biodiversity. So, if commercially valuable tree species continue only in a small fraction of the tree stand, then it may not be economically effective to clear cut an entire land. So, in a sense, if we want to grow or we want a particular species of tree that doesn't grow well under those conditions, that it's not effective to clear cut the land there. So this is true for like tropical rainforests where there's very like economically valuable trees. The one that comes to mind that's not usually in the text or in the AP standards are these mahogany trees. You know, a mahogany tree can bring one mahogany tree can feed a Costa Rican family for years. But the mahogany tree needs a very specific set of biodiversity conditions to grow. So if we come by and clear cut the forest, they'll never regrow back. They have to be selectively cut. Selective cutting removes a single tree or is relatively a small number of trees from a larger forest. And this method creates a small opening in a stand of trees that can be reseeded, or we can put younger trees planted in that area. So because seedlings and younger trees must only need a lot of time to grow larger and larger, selective cutting really produces optimum growth among the shade tolerant types of tree species. So the environmental impact of selective cutting is less extensive, of course, than clear cutting. However, the negative environmental impacts associated with logging just in general are essentially the same. Whether a company uses clear cutting or selective cutting methods, it will need to construct logging roads to carry equipment and workers and other things where we harvest these trees. So these road fragments of the forest habitat in which species are considered diverse, through all of this human traffic, we also compact the soils, causing nutrient loss and reduction in water filtration. So a third approach to these timber harvesting practices might be ecological sustainable forestry, which basically removes trees from the forest in ways that do not affect the viability of the other species that are in the actual forest. This approach has a goal of maintaining both plant and animal in close proximity with each other and as close to the natural state as possible. So some loggers have been returning to the use of animals like horses to pull logs and reduce soil compact. Um, and then although the cost of this method is really high and it's actually kind of difficult to make it even economically viable, it is taking place. So logging, deforestation, and reforestation, approximately 30% of all commercial timber in the world is produced in the United States and in Canada. My favorite, my favorite clip from the Lorax is, "What are you doing? You promised. You promised you wouldn't cut down all the trees." If you look on the left-hand side, we see a clear-cut forest. And underneath it, we see what's called strip cutting. It's not really inside of your text or in the curriculum, but I want you to know about it. So there's an uncut forest on both sides of, let's just say, a mountain. And so basically what they'll do is they'll cut a road and they'll clear cut into a strip of the actual forest. All right? This cutting into a strip by strip by strip nature allows for the larger trees, which are uncut at the bottom closest to the waterway, to absorb all of the eroding conditions, and the uncut forest up top to also absorb eroding and rain conditions. And so they clear cut into a mountain somewhere, and you see this pretty typical in Georgia. If you were to drive through the northern Georgia mountains, you would see a lot of this strip cutting. It's essentially clear cutting, but in a more manageable fashion. That's a lot of verbiage for basically saying one thing. No matter how we do it, when we go in to cut part of a forest, we change the environment, we change the landscape, we change the biodiversity, we impact the soil, we impact the water. All right? If we use things like herbicides or anything else, then we just increase the number of impacts that we have regardless of how we harvest trees. Timber harvesting practices like clear cutting and selective cutting essentially result, whether it's a single tree or a small number of trees, result in changing the diversity in the forest and the age of the trees that are there. This changing process in many ecosystems, fire is a natural process that is important to the nutrient cycle and regeneration of a forest. And as we discussed before, when fires are periodically, when they move through an ecosystem, they basically liberate all of these tied up nutrients and transfer it into biomass and provide more nutrients for things on the bottom of the forest floor to grow. And in addition, where this vegetation is killed by fire, this basically opens up the new blossoms for new seasonal plants. And so if we look here, though, due to foresting and logging, I have a map of Yellowstone National Park. And you can see that the fires that have occurred over the course of the last 100+ years. Anything that you see in blue is a recorded 1881 to 1900 fire perimeter, and then as the years have increased, we now get to the 2011-2018 recorded perimeters. And hopefully you look at this diagram and you see one very important thing, and that is that over the course of the last 100 years, the actual area that has caught fire has increased. So we talked briefly about this third approach, the ecological sustainable forest, which removes trees from the forest in these non-invasive ways. The removal of trees from this forest has definitely still logging, deforestation, and reforestation effects. All logging disrupts habitat and usually has an effect either being negative or positive on the plant and animal species there. So, through all of this, one thing that we all try to do is reforestation. Timber production presents an ecological challenge, period, and all logging disrupts the habitat. Logging often replaces complex forest ecosystems with tree plantations. And tree plantations are a large area that's typically planted with a single rapidly growing tree species. When these tree plantations grow, these same aged stands can easily be clear cut for commercial purpose, like making pulp or wood or whatever, and then replanted again. Because of this cycle of planting and harvesting tree plantations, that these trees never grow and develop to mature, and so they never really become ecologically diverse forests. If too many planting and harvesting cycles occur, the soils become very depleted, and important nutrients basically leave the whole system, like calcium. In 1982, the federal regulations required that USFS to provide appropriate habitat for planting and animal communities where this same multiple use forest replanting system is there. So because these regulations fail to specify how diversity needs to be protected, and they're basically these low, very soft laws, the government has had to choose its own approach to what biodiversity management is. And so critics of the federal government and these organizations are not, they're basically saying they're not adequately protecting biodiversity in these tree plantations. So here we have an example of a tree plantation starting over, where they've clear cut the forest and they're organizing their trees, getting ready to plant them so that they can grow really quickly in the open sunlight and prepare again for quick harvest. If you look around the globe, all right, the dark blue areas are essentially where the larger tree covering is. And the lighter in green to yellow we go, there's very little or no tree cover. And so I pulled this map off to just show you where logging and harvesting forest is most commonplace and most necessary. And if you see, that's where we are. That's where we live, right there. But I bet you already knew that. I bet you've already seen lots of logging vehicles and logging sites very, very close to where we live.